Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Valley Best Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. And I am Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning, as always, by my teacher and friend, Rabbi Mark Gelman, with a newly repaired computer. We're glad to have you, Mark.
Yay!
Nice to have you back. It was wonderful to be together a couple of weeks ago. I'm glad
was it fun?
and
And thank everybody for showing up that night. It was just great to see everybody who listens to us, and thank you so much. And for your kind words. It was just a delight. It was great to see you.
Well, this morning, of course, as we open the Torah, and this morning we opened Parshat Lech Lecha, the third Torah portion in the Torah, the beginning of the Jewish people, the choosing of Abraham. We do this, of course, both of us, both Mark and me, and every Jewish teacher and every Jew in the world opens up their Torah this morning with a real heavy heart. The events of the last 3 weeks have been so horrendous, and as the revelations have come about just how brutal the attack was 3 weeks ago, and now that we witness the response, first Israel was supported widely by the world, but now, of course, the response comes, and the response has been so difficult, particularly on college campuses. We see so much castigation, so much sense. The one of the writers this morning put in their blog, it's all about the word "but." Right? There was a terrible thing that happened, but it was expected, it was deserved, it was, which, as a great writer once said, everything before the "but" is wiped out, and this kind of thing just breaks our hearts. So we want to open up the Torah and find a little insight. One of the questions that I think we ought to ask today is, who are we in the world? And let me just begin an introduction, and then I'd like to ask Mark this question. It seems to me that the book of Genesis, in fact, the whole Torah, is a drama in 3 acts. We are introduced to a character named God at the very beginning, and the God of the Bible is not the God of Aristotle. It's not the God of philosophy. This God, we only know 2 things about this God. This is the God who creates, and this is the God who dreams, because creation is organized in such a way that it's very clear that there is a plan in mind. And this God introduces a character into the world to share the world of creation, the task of creation, and I would submit to share the dream of a world of harmony and oneness. And that, of course, is the human being, the only creature God puts in the world who has the capacity to choose. In other words, this is the only creature that can be self-created. And God puts this creature in the world, expects this creature to share the dream of a world of oneness, and right away this creature betrays God's dream, because we would rather have the power of self-creation than all the paradise that God provides for us. And the individuation, our choice of ourselves, eventually alienates us from each other, alienates us from God, alienates us from the world of nature. And at the end of Act 1, God says, to heck with all this. There's no future to this. I'm going to destroy it all. And just before he destroys it all, he chooses one human being who seems to have moral potential. His name is Noah. Wipes out everything else but saves Noah. But Noah can't be a partner, either because the moral fiber was flawed to begin with, or because the experience of watching the destruction of the world destroys his soul. But the world once again gets filled with violence and with terror. And God says, I couldn't create a partner. I couldn't choose one. Perhaps I can teach one. And God settles upon this man, Abraham, and says, you will be my partner. And this week's Torah portion begins with those words. Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave home. Leave the culture you know, leave the values you were raised in, leave your position and your power, leave your identity behind, and start over again. And be my vessel of blessing in the world. He says to Abraham, Heye bracha, be a blessing. And then, in case you missed it, in the next sentence, it's v'nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama, and in you shall all the peoples of the world be blessed. And that is the task of the Jewish people. That's sort of the job description. to be a blessing. And Abraham is given these blessings. He's given fame and fortune. He's given divine protection, which he doesn't exactly believe in, by the way. And he's
Right.
given the land. He's given the land. And this begins our career in the world. Now, one of the great questions of the Midrash is why Abraham? And there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is that Abraham earns this. And so we have the story that we all learned in Hebrew school, which is not in the Bible. It's a Midrash worthy of Rabbi Gelman, of Abraham smashing the idols. In other words, Abraham discovers God before God discovers Abraham. That's the Midrash's idea. The other idea I would submit is that Abraham was chosen rather randomly. I like to joke that his name began with an A. You know, God just was first guy in line, you know,
If
because
his name was Zeke, he never would have
he
been
never
chosen.
would have gotten chosen. Because the whole idea is I can take a human being and teach him to become a vessel of divine blessing in the world. And he keeps slipping backwards. Like the next story after we're told that Abraham follows God's instruction, goes to the new land, scouts out the land. There's a famine in the land. He goes down to Egypt, and immediately he begins doubting whether he's really under God's protection, because he tells his wife, tell him you're my sister, otherwise they're going to kill me. And that leads to a whole very a sort of dark comic drama where Pharaoh takes Sarah into his palace, and when he goes in to be with this woman that he's now kidnapped, he suddenly discovers that this is Abraham's wife. Don't ask how. So the question is, who is this guy Abraham? Why is he chosen? Why is he the vessel of God's blessing in the world? And here's the biggest question, which takes us right back to where we are today, where you and me are talking today, is why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to be God's guy in the world? Why is it that we keep attracting the enmity and the hatred and the violence of the world to ourselves like a lightning rod?
Well, the teacher of your teacher, Mordecai Kaplan, thought that there was some, now we would say it's blaming the victim, but that in some ways we bear some responsibility for anti-Semitism because we have claimed to be, based on this week's Parsha, the chosen people, chosen by God, and that other people felt envy for this and hatred for this, and felt that we were arrogant in claiming a relationship with God that other people didn't have. And so he, in fact, went so far as to change the Torah brachas that have Bachar Banu, who has chosen us, Asher Kerav Tanu, who has changed it into who has brought us near to the commandments, and rejecting the chosen people idea. And early Reform Judaism followed in that kind of, I would call, self-flagellation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the sobering elements of this war is the perdurance of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it still exists, and that since the Holocaust, we now have a pogrom that's just as brutal, in fact, in some ways more brutal, than any of the pogroms that existed during the Holocaust itself. And how is it possible that after the murder of 6 million Jews, you still have this level of violence against Jews? And you hear on, the anti-Israel segments, well, Israel's a colonialist power and it's oppressing the Palestinians. And this is the country that withdrew from Gaza and left farmland and factories behind, and they were destroyed. So and took the money that they got and built tunnels and kills people in the most brutal way. So I think it's time for us to answer the kids who are asking this question, some of them for the first time in their lives.
Mhm.
Children who have never really had any kind of experience of anti-Semitism. Kids from Long Island, kids from Encino. And we have to answer it. Why do people hate Jews? Why is anti-Semitism something that cannot be eradicated? And I think you've given, I think, the best answer that I've ever heard, which is because of what we teach, because of how we are calling the world to live on a higher level. And people don't want that. They resent that. They resent people telling them to live on a higher level because it seems arrogant. And I think that they hate us for that.
Hmm.
Then we can't also ignore the teaching of contempt as pious, as John Paul II referred to it, the teaching of contempt in the New Testament, that we were responsible for the death of Jesus.
Hmm.
And if you have 2,000 years of teaching,
Mhm.
particularly on Good Friday, when it was their Yom Kippur, and everyone was in church,
Right.
and where the priests would read the story. Imagine if, there were actual Egyptians around when we're doing the Seder. And imagine we were in control of anything. It's not surprising to think that Jews would go running out of their Seders to kill Egyptians. So we have Christian anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness, to be more precise about it. And we have that. And then we have economic reasons for anti-Semitism, which, as an old, now repentant Marxist, I can't give up. And the economic reasons are quite fascinating to me. And they involve this. In the Middle Ages, Europe had no idea that in order to produce an economy that would sustain itself, you have to reinvest the money that you make. You can't just use it to build castles and suits of armor, because that just uses up your money and it doesn't produce anything that you can sell and make more money. And not until the Industrial Revolution did Europe sort that all out. So if you build castles and suits of armor, eventually you don't have any money left and you have to go borrow some more money.
Mhm.
Well, you couldn't get any money from anyone, so you borrowed it from Jews who couldn't be farmers, so we had to be money lenders. And we lent money, and they couldn't pay the money back. And so in 1302, Pope Innocent III issues a papal bull saying, "Oh, we'd like to pay you back, but you killed Jesus, so we can't." And so they expropriated Jewish money and wiped out the debt. And that's basically why we got expelled from Spain in 1492. So and for many people, Hitler's anti-Semitism, in addition to being fueled by personal prejudice, unquestionably, was also fueled by his understanding that he could expropriate all the wealth of the German Jewish community and use it to arm the Reich, to invade Poland, first Austria and the Anschluss, and then Poland, and start the war. So some of the motivation for anti-Semitism was a bank job. It was a way to steal money from Jews. And they used this as an ideology to justify their theft. And I think finally, there's a reason for anti-Semitism, and that is something that only people of color understand. And that is, it is a natural human impulse to create a pecking order and to say, these people are below us, and those people are below you, and those people are below them. And we were the blacks of Europe. We were the bottom of the pecking order. In America, African Americans, blacks were the bottom. And so we were able to use our white skin privilege, I guess it's called in the left, to elevate ourselves and to achieve assimilation. But all of a sudden, something happens, and people say, you know what? You're still below us. Now, I have never, because of my long friendship with Tom Hartman, I have never been sympathetic to the theory that Christians drink anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. I don't believe that. I actually believe that the modern increase in anti-Semitic incidents, certainly in Paris, certainly in Europe, and in America as well, is largely fueled by the Israel-Arab conflict and by Arab anti-Semitism, even though they're Semites too. I think a lot of it comes from that. So those are the reasons for people hating Jews. And what we've been living through in America, particularly in post-World War II America, which let's not forget is only about 60 years in our history of 2,000 years, is a very, very unusual bubble of freedom. It occurred before World War II in Germany, called Weimar, the Weimar period, when Jews had extraordinary privileges. It also occurred in Spain during the period of Ibn Gabirol and Maimonides, who achieved high levels of power in Muslim Spain until the radical Almohades invaded and Maimonides had to flee to Fez in Egypt. But we're living in a bubble, and that bubble, perhaps, I pray not, but perhaps that bubble is popped. And perhaps we're living at the end of that bubble, and we have to hunker down now.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because the question, even, I mean, let's turn the question upside down. Even ask the question, why do people still hate Jews? Comes from that bubble. It comes from a place where for a whole generation or more, we haven't experienced widespread anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. You know, my parents knew it in many, many ways. My parents certainly grew up in a different world than I did, a world in which there were colleges Jews didn't go to, neighborhoods Jews didn't live in, businesses that would not admit Jews. By the time I came into the world, most of that was wiped away. Most of that was wiped away. And it wasn't part of my experience. And thank goodness it hasn't been part of the experience of my children. It is now part of their experience. And what's shocking to this generation is because it is part of their experience. Their great-grandparents would not have been shocked. I mean, what might shock them, ironically, is that they always assumed that anti-Semitism would arise among the religious and among the right. And now anti-Semitism arises on college campuses, which are anything but religious and largely of the left. That's the interesting contrast. And the idea that people that we thought were our allies in fighting for social justice are so ready to blame Israel for everything, to ignore all of the nuance of that conflict, and to call Israel a colonialist, imperialist, militarist, genocidal, all of these kinds of names, and to ignore what happened, to denigrate, demote the catastrophe that we've experienced in favor of a different kind of thing, and not be able to see the difference between fighting for Palestinian justice, which is something that many Israelis will tell you is critical to their survival, and recognizing Hamas violence. The fact that it's arising on the left, arising in universities, which we always assumed was a place of open thought, of exchange of ideas, exchange of values, a place where we were welcome. The fact that we have to ask the question now indicates how unusual that bubble was. And so perhaps the question ought to be asked on the other side, not what are the causes of anti-Semitism and why did anti-Semitism come back and why is it in the world altogether, but rather, what are the unusual circumstances that give Jews freedom? What are the unusual ideological, economic, social circumstances that enables a generation or two or three to live without being touched by anti-Semitism? And there you'd have to count things like liberal democracy, like a sense of religious pluralism, an openness to alternative narratives, these kinds of factors of American democracy or liberal democracy around the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I would also lift up the example of the God Squad. The truth of the matter is, anti-Semitism is destroyed by personal friendships.
Mm.
As if you think of Jews as a group, and you don't know any Jews really,
mm-hmm.
It's really easy to hate them. Just like if you don't know any blacks and you have no black friends. When we used to go to high schools, would say, or when I would teach in the synagogue, I'd ask the kids, how many of you have friends who aren't exactly like you? And not too many hands went up.
Hmm.
And so friendship is what destroys hatred. I remember my father introducing me to a man named Leo Kamik, who was a Polish Catholic from Milwaukee, who my dad had befriended because he met him during World War II. They served together. And I went to see Leo one day. I was a young boy. And Leo turned to me. I'll never forget that. He said, your father saved my life. We were in a foxhole and blah, blah, blah. And he pulled me back in a bomb and it saved my life. And I always say this Jewish guy saved my life. And I say a Jewish guy because I grew up in a Polish Catholic home that was taught to hate Jews.
Mm.
And I hated Jews because I was taught to hate Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And your father changed my life. Your father changed my life. And, then I began to think as I grew about my grandmother, who I loved deeply and powerfully, talking about, did the Schwarze come today? Now, I know she didn't mean the N-word, but it wasn't exactly a complimentary term.
No.
And I realized, my God, I grew up with that. I grew up in a home in which using that word was legitimate. Well, that's how people become prejudiced. They drink it. We all drink it.
Mhm.
with our mother's milk. It's not just Christians. We all drink prejudice.
Mhm.
And it's really tough. It's really tough to recognize when you're being taught the teaching of contempt.
So let's take a moment before we conclude, because it's important to finish with a note of hope.
Yes, let's do that.
So let's go back to Lech Lecha.
Mhm.
So God chooses Avram, and implicitly God chooses all of those who come after Avram. That's the beginning of our people, and gives him this task, be a blessing. So as you think about, and you've been involved in Jewish life your whole life, but particularly as a rabbi and as a teacher, what exactly is it that we are put into the world to teach the world? What exactly are we put into the world as a Jewish people? What is it, our mission? If you think about not just to survive, that's certainly part of our mission, but what is our mission vis-a-vis the whole world? What is it we are here to teach the world in a sentence or two?
Yeah, we're here to teach the world one thing,
Yeah.
that all people are made in the image of God.
Mhm.
That's it.
And
All
there,
people are made B'Tselem Elohim, everyone, all of them. And that teaching in the Torah occurs before there's a Jewish people.
mhm.
That's Adam. That's the beginning of all people, that we are told by the Torah that we're made in the image of God. And if we're all made in the image of God, it means that any kinds of prejudice is a prejudice against God. Any kind of hatred is a hatred against God. And that when there's a wonderful, wonderful story of Reb Nachman walking with his Hasidim of Bratslav, and he looks across the road and he says, stops them all, says, points, who is that? Who is that across the street walking there? And they looked, they said, nobody, Rebbe, it's nobody, it's Moishela the water drawer. It's nobody, just Moishela, the water carrier. And he says to them, none of you are my students.
Mm.
None of you are my students. They said, why, Rebbe, why? They said, because you can't be my students until, no matter who you see across the street, you answer the question, who is that there? With this answer, oh, Rebbe, that's the image of God walking across the street there.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I would just add no argument at all, but I would add just a different way to put a similar idea. If you begin with this idea of a God who dreams of a world of oneness, and the Garden of Eden is the image, and a garden is such an interesting thing if you think about it. You know, God didn't put us into the world in a castle or a fortress or a palace. A garden is a place where nature and artifice come together, where everything is there to nurture everything else. So there is a biological symbiosis. It's all growing together, and it's aesthetically pleasing because it's all harmonious. The idea that the world was meant to be one, was meant to be harmonious, but we all have different parts to play. Every element of the garden has its own place, but it was all meant to be one. And that's the teleology. That's where we're trying to take the world, to a place of oneness, and that it's possible, that oneness is built into the reality. That's why the phrase that we often use is we talk about the world is broken and the task is tikkun. Well, the idea of broken and tikkun means that wholeness is latent within it, and we can make it whole. It's not that the contradictions make the world incongruent. That will never be fixed. The brokenness means the pieces are there. We've got to figure out how to put them back together. And that's the task. And that's the task of humanity in the world. Mark, let's pray for a better week. Let the new week bring
Amen.
peace. Thanks for joining me. Thank you to everyone, and have a quiet and a peaceful Shabbos. Pick up a pen, a computer, a telephone, and write to your members of Congress to continue to support and protect the state of Israel. Write to the local newspaper to get it right this time and not print articles that are false. And hold on to each other as we go through this crisis. Take good care. Shabbat
Amen.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.